Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali. I'm a final year medical student at Cambridge University.
I'm Abby. I'm another final year student. I'm also new here.
And today we're going to be talking about the Charlie Gard case. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the law side of it, and we're going to be focusing on the medical ethics side of it and the medical ethical issues that it raised, along with issues that it raised for wider society. Does that sound alright?
Sounds good to me.
Excellent.
I love this kind of thing.
As usual, everything that we mention is going to be linked in the video description, so you can see the structure of the video and you can share specific bits, and you don't have to watch it all in one go, all of that stuff. But yeah, let's get started.
So a little while ago now, in August 2016, there was this boy called Charlie Gard who was born with, sadly, a very sad condition that causes brain and muscle damage. It's called MDDS, but there's kind of a whole group of conditions like this that sadly very neurodegenerative, so they get worse and worse as the life goes on. We don't really have a treatment for it. Usually causes death within the first year of life. Understandably, this was extremely upsetting for the parents, and they kind of cast around looking for any hope, and hope was offered by a particular American doctor who said that he had an experimental treatment that might make a difference. They wanted to fly him over to the US, and the doctors at Great Ormond Street, which is the top children's hospital in this country, said no, that wasn't in his best interests. Because of that, a whole court battle ensued, which is what we'll kind of be talking about for the rest of the video. And as you probably know if you're watching it, there was also a huge media storm over this particular case. It was very highly covered both in this country and interestingly also in the US, and was linked into a lot of other issues, so it became quite a big issue.
Yeah, so that's basically what happened with the Charlie Gard case. It was ultimately a really controversial case that captured the attention of everyone from Donald Trump to the Pope. Though it's
arguably not that difficult to capture Donald Trump's attention.
Not quite. And eventually everything kind of hinged on this idea of what's in Charlie's best interests. Great Ormond Street Hospital thought that continuing to provide treatment or providing this experimental treatment wouldn't be in his best interests, and they got the opinion from lots of experts agreeing with them. But Charlie's parents felt that, we should give him a chance at the experimental treatment. What's the harm in it? And that was what the courts kind of decided. So we've deliberately just given you a very kind of simple summary of what happened, but there is a very, very good BBC News article that we'll link in the description below, and that'll also appear on screen somewhere here. If you're not entirely familiar with the details of the Charlie Gard case, we would really recommend you have a look at that BBC News article, because it's very readable. It covers exactly what happened. It answers questions like, why were the courts involved? Why did they want to fly to the US? Why did they ultimately decide against giving treatment? It's very readable. So if you don't know much about it, I'd suggest you pause the video now and have a read of this article, and then we will be waiting when you get back.
That is your homework.
Okay, so that was what happened in the case. Before we talk about the legal and the ethical side of it, I just want to read you a little bit of Justice Francis's opening words. So he was the judge who presided over the case and who kind of saw all the evidence provided by both parties. And on the 24th of July 2017, he wrote a 20-part statement, which again we'll link in the description below, which is again very readable, so you should have a read of it if you're interested in this. But I just want to read you the first paragraph of it, sort of paraphrasing a bit, because I think it really sets the tone of what this case is. It is impossible for any of us to comprehend or even begin to imagine the agony to which Charlie's parents have been subjected in recent weeks and months, as they have had to come to terms with the decision that they have now made. A lot of things have been said by those who know almost nothing about this case, but who feel entitled to express opinions. I must, again, pay tribute to Chris Gard and Connie Yates for the love and care which they have at all times given to their wonderful boy Charlie. There are few, if any, stronger bonds known to humankind than the love that a parent has for his or her child. To lose a child, particularly at such a tender age and in such tragic circumstances, is grief of a magnitude of immense proportions. These parents should know that no parent could have done more for their child. They have, however, now accepted that Charlie's life cannot be improved, and that the only remaining course is for him to be given palliative care and to permit him to die with dignity. So that's what the judge said on the 24th of July, and Charlie tragically passed away on the 28th of July.
And I do think that it's worth remembering through all of this, then I was thinking, God, actually it's kind of in the public domain, and it is really hard to talk about because it's a child who's died, right? And yeah, I think we do have to remember through all of it that you're dealing with loss that neither of us can really comprehend for these parents. But because of how incredibly overblown and amplified all of the issues were by the media, it has become a bigger issue and something that's worth discussing beyond that, but yeah.
So that's what happened with Charlie's case, and again, links in the description if you want to read more about it. We would suggest you kind of find out more about the story of what happened, because now we're going to be talking about the legal side of it and the ethical side of it. So let's start by talking about the legal side of things. Why was a judge involved in the first place, and how did it all work? So there's a great article written by a guy called Ian Bressington, again linked below, and it's in the blog of the British medical journal, the Journal of Medical Ethics.
Which is a fabulous journal.
It's a very good journal, and it's a very readable blog, so I would suggest you read that if you want a kind of more opinionated version of what happened. He gives his own opinion rather than just stating the facts. And I kind of agree with his opinion. He says that legally this case was very straightforward. The problem was there was a disagreement between the parents and the hospital as to what the best interests of Charlie were. Parents thought he should continue to have treatment and have this experimental treatment. The hospital thought that that was probably futile and it wasn't in his best interests. So given that dispute, the courts, an independent body, were brought in to kind of adjudicate, to hear the evidence from both sides and to decide what really is in Charlie's best interest.
In all of this, Dr. Hirano is the US doctor who came and said, actually, I think we could do something to help Charlie. And he was offering something called nucleoside bypass therapy, which I don't claim to be an expert on at all. Yeah. But my understanding is it's quite an experimental therapy. Hadn't yet been tested in a child at all, I think. The problem is that it's thought that at the time when he actually gave his initial assessment, he hadn't necessarily seen up-to-date scans of the child, and it wasn't really kind of transferred in the way that we normally would. So it's quite a commonplace thing in medicine for doctors, so say at the hospital we work at here, Adam Brooks, a lot of the doctors will discuss with their colleagues in different countries, and they have these clever rooms that look all futuristic, where there are big screens and they bring up scans, and some things they have the expertise in and some things other people do. And the information wasn't really shared in this way. It was more like somebody coming and offering something that was new without necessarily having a full view of the facts, or without necessarily having liaised properly with the doctors that were looking after Charlie. So that was one of the kind of problems in the case.
And Dr. Hirano has often been criticised by commentators afterwards for being the main person to provide undue hope to Charlie's parents, because he was the one who said that they could offer this experimental therapy. Importantly, Charlie had a strain of the mitochondrial disease that this treatment had never been tested on before. It had been tested on mice in a variant of that particular one, but Charlie's condition was a lot worse because it affected his brain and muscles rather than just his muscles. Again, more facts on the Wikipedia article, we'll put a link in the description. But, you know, that was one of the issues around this, that this supposed expert from America was offering this treatment even though the evidence really wasn't there. And the doctors at Gosh and their team of experts around the world said that actually the evidence probably isn't there. The judge agreed with them. And that was why the best interests decision weighed on the side of not offering the treatment and withdrawing life support care from Charlie, because it was felt that every day that he was around was a day where he was experiencing suffering and just being unable to express it because, you know, the brain damage and the muscle damage. So that's the legal side of things. Again, we'll put links in the description to the statement that the justice made, which you can have a read of by yourself. It's very easy to read and very illustrative as to what went on in the case. But now we want to focus a bit on kind of the medical and societal ethical dilemmas that the case raised. We're not pretending to be experts in medical ethics.
Not
we're
even
just
vaguely an
expert.
expert.
Not even vaguely.
We're very happy to discuss it.
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. And we're just going to kind of raise the points, and you know, I think it's important to be aware of these. If you're applying for your medicine interviews and watching this, then yeah, just being aware of these points is a good thing. And if you're not, or you're just interested in the case, it is very interesting, as is the whole field of medical ethics generally.
Yeah.
I think
it's very current. I think we're seeing more and more of these cases. So there's one at the moment with a baby called Isaiah. Oh no, I can't say. And it's not the same case, and there are definitely, it's been less big in the media, and there aren't the same kind of factors around it. But it's another case of a baby who the doctors and parents don't agree over whether his life support should be continued. So this is kind of something that's going to keep coming up because of various factors that we'll probably talk about later.
So in terms of structure, we're going to be talking about 5 main ethical issues that the case of Charlie Gard raised. Firstly, we're going to be talking about autonomy. Secondly, we're going to be talking about this balance between beneficence and non-maleficence. Thirdly, we're going to be talking about justice, allocation of resources. Fourthly, we're going to be talking about the ethics of research and experimental treatment, especially in kids. And finally, we're going to be discussing a little bit about euthanasia and whether the Charlie Gard case falls under the blanket term of euthanasia. And then after that, we'll be discussing a little bit about wider societal issues that the Charlie Gard case brought to light.
These are a lot of things to discuss, Ali.
A lot of things to discuss, yeah. Hopefully
All
we'll
of
be able
these
to do
could
it.
be books.
Yes, exactly. So we're just
We'll
gonna.
just touch on them.
So let's start by talking about point number 1, which is autonomy.
So in this case, when we say autonomy, which generally means your right to make a decision, we're actually mostly talking about the parent's right to make a decision, because with a young baby and with a disabled young baby, there's not that much personal autonomy that we give them. So here, it's really interesting. We're talking about how much control does a parent have over their kid's life, and in this case, over their kid's medical treatment, which is quite a big issue, something that most of us probably struggled with as teenagers. How much control do our parents deserve to have over our lives, right? But it gets particularly fraught in cases like this, where the doctors disagree about what should happen next. And generally the accepted legal position has tended to be that parents have the right to choose between choices that are offered normally. So if they're kind of two reasonable choices given as the way to go forward, with a young child, the parents are the ones that normally have the right to make the decision. But if the doctors say that's not a reasonable option, and that could be the other way around from this case, that could be that doing nothing isn't a reasonable option, or that withdrawing care isn't a reasonable option, then the normally doesn't come under parental autonomy to choose those things. And part of that is because you're dealing with a patient who doesn't have autonomy of themselves.
Yeah, so autonomy is one of the 4 principles of medical ethics, and it's kind of the structure that we always suggest you answer the medical ethical questions with. Again, there's a video on that on the channel. Again, we'll link it in the description below. But yeah, as Abby said, this case was very much about autonomy. Should the parents decide, or should the doctors get to decide? And in English law, it's not that the child is kind of the property of the parents. What the parents believe or choose doesn't automatically trump what the medical opinion is. And ultimately, as we said earlier, it's all about the best interests of the child. And the doctors have to take the parents' view into account. But if they disagree with the parents' view, as was the case here, then it goes to a third party, an independent court, to decide what happens.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting you were saying in English law this is the case. And I think that's why this is such an interesting area of ethics, is because we do need people to have decided what's right, and it's different in different parts of the world because people have decided differently. It's very finely balanced, and it's very difficult to know what's correct to do in these really painful situations that are basically always going to be painful and difficult, but there has to be some solution.
Absolutely. And what Abby said, this thing about this being specific to English law is part of the reason why this case got a lot of media attention in the US especially. Because in America, the system of the courts is very politicized. Political parties appoint particular judges, and as soon as something goes to the courts, it becomes a political affair. Whereas
and you can watch it on TV.
And you can watch it on TV, exactly. Yeah, it becomes this media-wide thing. Whereas in the UK, the courts are, by their very nature, specifically designed to be independent from the government. So it's not like, the courts do what the government says. It's kind of like the courts are supposed to keep a check on what the government is doing and all this. So a lot of American commentators were saying that, in America we would have a system where we would care about what the parents say. We wouldn't ignore their decisions. And they were making it out as if, the state, the government, the NHS was holding Charlie captive by ignoring what the parents were saying. But that's not really what happened at all. It's more that, when the parents and the medical profession have different views, you need an independent third party, i.e. the court, to arbitrate this dispute. And that was exactly what happened. And I personally think that that's a pretty good way of doing things. I don't know what you reckon.
Yeah, I agree. And also I think what you said just now is very interesting when you said, we'd let the parents decide, whereas there it's the state, it's the NHS. And that was also a big thing in the American media coverage, is the idea of the state being able to decide kind of got conflated with the idea of a national health service. And it was in the middle of them having their own big debates about what their health service should look like and what their kind of insurance plan should change like, and so it got conflated into this nanny state NHS, which is just terrible and just pulls out life support machines of children whenever they feel like it, which probably isn't totally representative.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's the autonomy, that's the debate. Should the parents decide? Should the doctors decide? Where's the middle ground there? Again, we're just raising the issues. We're not pretending to be experts. You can have a read of the links in the description and form your own opinions. Point number 2 is going to be about balancing this idea of beneficence, doing good, with non-maleficence, not doing harm. And that was the thing that, again, clashed in the Charlie Gard case. So the proponents of the experimental therapy said something along the lines of, look, we know this therapy is experimental, but the alternative is to just let Charlie die. And surely, even if there's a very, very tiny chance of him, improving because of this treatment, surely we should take that. Whereas, if we don't take it, we're just condemning him to death. So they were kind of viewing the preservation of life as being above almost anything else, that even the slimmest chance of recovery is surely better than no chance of recovery at all.
Which is a very understandable position when you're in such a horrible situation, I think. But the problem with it is there actually is a harm in undertaking almost any treatment. Even when you take paracetamol or something, you know that you're balancing up risk and harm. And particularly in a treatment like this that involved flying a very sick baby all the way over to the US and putting him through an experimental treatment, there is a real risk-harm benefit. So it's not quite as simple as this was his one shot and why not take it if it's worth something.
The other side of the debate is from people who were against the treatment and in favour of withdrawing Charlie's life support, was that every day that this was dragging on was another day that Charlie was suffering, but just unable to express it. And I'm going to read out a bit from the statement that Great Ormond Street Hospital put out after the case kind of resolved. They said, at the first hearing in Charlie's case in March 2017, Great Ormond Street's position was that every day that passed was a day that was not in his best interests. That remains its view of his welfare. Even now, this was in July, Charlie shows physical responses to stressors that some of those treating him interpret as pain, and when 2 international experts assessed him last week, they believed that they elicited a pain response. If Charlie has had a relationship with the world around him since his best interests were determined, it has been one of suffering. And this idea that Charlie was continuing to suffer for every day is partly what made this such a difficult situation to deal with, because when Dr. Hirano brought forth his new evidence that resulted in Charlie's parents naturally wanting a retrial and the judge being fully open to listening to this new evidence, that it dragged this on and potentially dragged on Charlie's suffering. And then later when they found out that actually Dr. Hirano hadn't even examined that Charlie hadn't even read the judge's statements about him, hadn't even looked at the contemporaneous medical notes, and was still offering this hope to the parents despite every day being potentially causing Charlie to suffer. That was one of the things that made this really, really hard.
It's really, I find Gosh's fuller statement, which maybe you'll link in underneath, is really emotive. And one of the things about this case which became quite difficult was the personal staff who were involved in caring for Charlie were subject to a really unprecedented amount of media attention and personal attention and real abuse. And that was very sad, because I think a lot of them were also very emotionally invested with him. And that's what really comes across in the statement, that actually, of course, this was difficult for the parents in a way that we can't imagine. But actually there were also a lot of staff that were genuinely very, very invested in caring for him, care for many children in a really excellent way, and provide good palliative care for a lot of children in a really excellent way. And I do think that was something that was there kind of throughout the whole thing. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's worth stating that Chris and Connie, Charlie's parents, fully condemned all of the abuse that the staff were receiving. They didn't endorse any of it, they didn't condone any of it, but when social media gets involved, when traditional media gets involved, suddenly people start protesting, start throwing out death threats. Just the world we live in, I guess.
Yeah, it just became a very polarised debate.
Okay, so we've talked about autonomy, beneficence and non-maleficence. Let's now talk about our fourth pillar of medical ethics, which is justice. And justice is all about kind of allocation of resources. Should the NHS necessarily fund experimental treatments, things like that? And actually, Charlie's parents started a fundraising campaign and managed to raise £1.3 million to fly Charlie to America to undergo this experimental treatment. But really, the debate here was never really about allocation of resources. Like, Great Ormond Street did agree that actually, if they thought the treatment was in Charlie's best interest, they would have provided it regardless of the cost.
And I think that's something that we often forget in this country. The NHS already do provide extraordinarily expensive treatments. If they're not offered in this country, they'll fly you to across the world to receive them. That's true for various things. That's under the NHS. If you have extenuating circumstances, if you have something that we can't deal with here, they do that. It's not just because of the cost. Yeah. And indeed, when cost was taken out of it because the parents were wanting to fund this privately, obviously the debate was very much still raging on.
Yeah. But even despite that, American media outlets still reported that, look at the NHS, this is what happens when you have a taxpayer-funded system. They won't fund this life-saving treatment for this poor child, and turned it into this big political debate with, people like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump tweeting about it, loads of media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, actually, which is normally quite, measured in their, in their journalism, treating this as this is a problem with the taxpayer system. So again, more links in the description, but just something to raise. This was part of the problem created by the whole media hype surrounding the case. Okay, so we've done autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence and justice. Let's now move beyond our 4 traditional principles of medical ethics and talk about another issue that was raised in this case, and that is this idea of doing experimental treatment, especially on children who can't consent.
Experimentation is really important in medicine. We wouldn't have basically any of the treatments that we currently do if we hadn't at some point tried them out when they were quite experimental. And it's very difficult on which patients it's reasonable to try those out, let alone with children. With adults it's very difficult, right? If you have a seriously ill patient and you have a treatment that we know works but maybe we'd kind of like to work better, and we have a treatment which might work better but we honestly don't know because it hasn't been tried in humans before, I mean, which would you choose? It's very hard. And all of those issues become amplified in the case of children who can't really themselves make the decision about whether to be part of that trial or about whether they should be receiving treatment or not. And so that's one of the kind of difficult issues raised by this case. I had a wonderful consultant who told me about the early days of children on chemotherapy, and she said that she honestly thought she remembers having fights with, she was like then a registrar or junior doctor or something, she remembers having fights with her consultant saying, this is unbelievably inhumane, how can we be doing this? Because these kids with leukemia and they were just kind of killing them, and yeah, as you've seen, like chemotherapy can do horrible things. And indeed we now know that the regimens that they were giving them weren't that helpful in most cases, but if that hadn't happened for a whole 10 years then no kids with leukemia would now be surviving. It's really hard. Yeah. I'm not sure you can put that on camera, it's too sad. I don't know. Anyway.
I mean, if you're okay with it, I think that's a really nice kind of insight to put.
It's horrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you just imagine being like the Reg on call when you're just basically poisoning children?
Yeah. But yeah, again, one of the issues raised with experimental treatments, especially in kids who can't consent. So yeah, it's difficult, but again, you can form your own opinions on that. Finally, we're going to end our admittedly quite heavy discussion about medical ethics with the idea of euthanasia. And we've got another euthanasia video on the channel, link in the description below.
So many videos, Ali.
So many videos.
So proud.
But essentially, this is not euthanasia. Despite a lot of media outlets, news articles, opinion pieces saying that this was a case of euthanasia, of physician-assisted suicide where the state was euthanizing Charlie Gard, that wasn't the case at all. Euthanasia is where you are doing something with the intent to kill someone. And in Charlie's case, the intent was never to kill. It was purely that the treatments that were being offered, i.e. the experimental treatment and his mechanical ventilation, those treatments were not in his best interests. It's not that continuing to live was not in his best interest, it's that those specific treatments weren't in his best interests. And despite what some commentators said, life support, mechanical ventilation, artificial feeding, all of this, these are medical interventions. And in the UK, and I think quite properly, we don't do medical interventions unless we strongly believe there's going to be a benefit to them. So this debate shouldn't really be about euthanasia at all. It should be about, was it right to withdraw the medical treatment? And yes, I personally believe it was right to withdraw the medical treatment. The judges believed that, the hospital doctors at Great Ormond Street believed that, because the treatment was not in Charlie's best interests. Okay, just one thing to add. We've just fact-checked this in a book, Tony Hope's. Very short introduction to medical ethics.
Indeed.
That's this one. And yeah, so what we were told in our lectures is that, we should avoid the use of the term passive euthanasia, because by a lot of people's definitions, euthanasia means you're intending for the patient to die. And that's unhelpful, because in the UK we draw the distinction between intending for the person to die and foreseeing their death as a side effect of withdrawing treatment. But as we found out from this book and from just doing a quick Google, some people do use the phrase passive euthanasia in the sense that we are withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, and they would use that as a blanket term.
And it is quite within medical ethics tradition to have that phrase within the mainstream. I do think it's nice if we can avoid using it, but just so you know. Yeah.
So yeah, when we say that this was explicitly not euthanasia, we're saying euthanasia in this very strict definition of you need to be intending for them to die as the main effect of withdrawing a treatment. Whereas, the way a lot of medical ethics books and commentators use passive euthanasia, it's that even if that's not your main intent, you will still call it passive euthanasia. Yeah.
Okay. I suppose the last little bit I was going to say was about how I think this case isn't really isolated, and it's a bit flawed to think of it in an isolated way. I think it's actually about a lot of bigger issues that are coming up at the moment quite regularly. So one of those is about kind of individualism and people everyone's Dr. Google now, and we're both guilty of it as well, right? When there's something wrong with you, and trust me, at medical school you do not learn about all the things that could go wrong with you. You want to Google it and see what's available and see what should happen, and feel that you have like a right to know that endpoint and to get as close to it as possible. And from that we've come into a culture where people are, for instance, raising a lot of money to travel across the world to have cancer treatments that aren't necessarily proven by evidence to work, and there have been other campaigns of people wanting their children to have certain things, and this idea of a last hope. And the other thing is about mistrust of the mainstream, which I think was a huge issue, particularly at the time that Charlie was alive, actually, with Donald Trump coming into power, and various issues around people saying, and also with Brexit, I remember it was a big thing, with various people in the campaign saying, oh, it doesn't matter if experts say this or statistics say that, like, it's not about that, it's about what we can see with our own eyes and what we deserve as people to have. And I do think that, sadly, those factors came together to create a really sad situation for this family, because they felt that even the world experts, who probably did have more of a thorough, comprehensive understanding of the case and the options on the table, and I do think that they have more of an understanding. Like,
I agree. Yeah.
I think, if anything, going through medical school is quite humbling in that sense. Like, I think my understanding of a lot of things in medicine is pretty limited, and I think that it's always worth looking to your seniors for that. And I think that the fact that they had this understanding was almost held against them. Like, then they couldn't possibly see that the best thing for him was going to be a chance that he was able to have. So there's a lot of things coming together, and for that reason, I think we will see more and more of these cases, and we are seeing more and more of these cases of people who are, in some ways, denied the best supportive care they could have by kind of hopes of something else, hopes of the mainstream being wrong or experts being wrong.
Okay, so that concludes this probably quite long video about the Charlie Gard case. We've mentioned briefly about the facts of the case, but pointed you to lots of resources where you can read more about it. We talked a little bit about the legal side of it and explained that everything focused around this idea of what was in Charlie's best interests, and because that was disputed by the doctors and the parents, then the courts were brought in to arbitrate the dispute. We've talked about 5 of the medical ethical issues that this case raised, namely autonomy, beneficence, maleficence, the mismatch between those, justice, allocation of resources, research ethics, especially on kids, and finally whether this was euthanasia. In our opinion, it wasn't. And finally, we've ended with a little bit of a discussion about wider societal implications of the Charlie Gard case. So thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. Hope you found it useful.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching, yeah. And we're going to end with a statement, which is like the last bit of the long written statement that Great Ormond Street Hospital released as this whole thing was wrapping up. So Abby, would you like to read that?
Yeah, so all of Gosh's thoughts go with Charlie and his mother and father. The hospital wishes each of them peace in their hearts at the end of this day and each day to come.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching.